Okay, so this is the second class. This is on perspective and measuring. If you weren't able to make the first class, my YouTube channel is where you can find um, all of the classes. I'll put them up there about 24 hours after the class is over. And if you go to my website, there's on the art classes page, I'm going to upload all the PDFs as well. So that there'll be a way for you to find that information later as we go through the summer. So once again, this information, my contact information and website and all of that stuff will be sent as a follow-up PDF after the class so that you'll have this information. So you can write things down as you go and make notes, but the things that are written actually on the screen will be sent to you after the class. So just to reiterate, going back over last week a little bit. So step one in drawing, if you're going to sort of pave the way for success, is to use a viewfinder. And I'm going to underscore this because I'm sure a lot of people go, oh yeah, I should be using a viewfinder. But then when it comes to actually, making one and using one, it's not the priority. You want to sit down and sketch and you think to yourself, oh gosh, I don't need that. I can figure out what it is that I want to draw. But I'm going to encourage you anyway to use the viewfinder. And Betsy just asked a really great question, which is what size the opening should be for the viewfinder. And what I do is I've got a 3x5 card. And so I've just got, this is probably what, 1 inch by 1.5 inches. I do very small notan. Now, when you're using a viewfinder, you can have a larger opening than that to find your scene and to work from. But I find for the notan, it's useful for me to start off really small. Because if you have a large opening in a piece of card or a piece of paper and you have to hold it further away from yourself to find the scene, it's a little hard to do that initial sketch. So I like to use a small viewfinder up front just to get my scene right. But you will often see people use larger ones. It's completely up to you. Now, if you find you're having trouble finding something that looks interesting, you're looking around and you're overwhelmed with all the stuff you see, how are you going to find something interesting? I find that the closer you get into objects, the easier it is to find interesting patterns of light and dark. So, I don't know, some of you in art school might, or in classes in high school, might have done exercises where you had to zoom in really close to objects to the point where you couldn't even really tell what they were. And that's part of this idea that there's a certain amount of abstraction that happens when you get in very close to objects. And I'm going to show you some examples in just a minute so you can see what I'm talking about. So in general, zooming in is a great technique for finding good design. So I took this picture a couple of years back in a park in London, and I loved these trees and the interesting way that they had been pruned. I'm not sure how good it is for the tree, but it looked really interesting. So, when I get home, I can either sit down and just draw exactly what I see in my photo, but that's not what I recommend at all. What I do recommend is either, if you took a picture, you can do this on your phone or on a computer, or however you can zoom in, or you can print the picture out, and you can with paper just bracket off the interesting part of the picture so you know what you're looking at. Basically, what you're trying to do is crop the image so that you have a little bit more of an interesting design. So in this particular case, because that tree without leaves on was what I was most interested in, and I liked the point of the building, then I made that more of the focal point and took the rest of the stuff out. Now, if I go ahead and draw this scene, I might even eliminate more things. I might take some of those branches above out, or I might simplify the amount of foliage. And those things are for later steps. But for now, I'm just trying to say, okay, look, there's good contrast. If I squint at this, there's some really good light and dark shapes there. And that's something that I know I can get started with. So here's another example. I took this picture along with some other broken crockery to sort of symbolize last year, that things were shattered, our lives were shattered, and that sort of thing. And so I just set up some layouts like this, and I took some photos. Now, these are for paintings that would be in color, but they would work just as well for drawing. However, there's too much information here right now. And I don't, although it's an interesting idea and I can see some interesting shadows, there's too, it's too spread out. You know, there's really not a lot of impact. So how you get impact is by zooming in and cropping out information. And I decided I liked this pattern of shapes, and I liked the way the shadows under the pieces of crockery work. So if I squint my eyes and look at this and look at the dark shapes, I said, yeah, that's something to work with. So if you're working from life or if you're working from photos and you're finding color is confusing you, which it often does, if you can either print the picture out as a black and white image on a piece of paper, or you can convert it on your phone to a black and white image, or something of that nature, that can help a lot. After a while, you'll get used to looking at things in nature and around your home. For you'll look at the contrast, and the color won't get in your way. But this is a way to have a look at it. One of the things that I might do if I were to take this to a drawing is I'd have to decide where, like, do I really want that line in the back? So I've got the dark value, I've got that middle value, which is all the stuff underneath the crockery, and then I've got a white background. And I would want to make little tiny sketches and play around with that and see what I wanted to do with the background. So moving on, just to review about notan and squinting. A notan is there to help you work out if you like the balance of the scene. So it's sort of when we're on this trip and we're going on our journey, it's the very first step that we take that sort of tells us the direction we're going in. If you don't like the contrast and the balance of the scene at the very beginning in the first steps, you are not going to like that drawing after you've spent 20 hours on it. And it'll be very, very frustrating. So the notan helps you work out whether or not you like the scene, if you think it has balance, and you can also change things in it. For example, you know, moving stuff around, taking things out. It's a lot easier to do that at the very small size. This also helps you work out a plan for the values in your drawing. Whoops, I went ahead. And this is one thing I felt I needed to clarify. So in the notan, when we're selecting light and dark based on squinting, it doesn't mean that the dark areas that we see when we squint will be that dark for the entire drawing. It just means that if one steps back from the drawing, you want to get that sort of feeling of design of light and dark. But within those dark areas and within those light areas, those values are going to get broken up. So they're still within the dark family or the medium to dark family, or they're still within the light family or light to medium family. But in general, you'll get this feeling of the whole design being anchored together by this sense of contrast. If everything is a middle tone, or everything is light, or everything is dark, you don't have the emphasis. So that's why we start with a notan and we start with squinting and looking for those dark shapes. So when I say, you know, look for something that's interesting, or decide if it's an interesting design, you may be, if you're a beginning artist, you may be going, I don't know what she means. You know, I don't know what an interesting design is. Is my design interesting? And so before you go through a lot of angst about this, I just want you to relax and go and think to yourself, if you think the scene is interesting, then it is an interesting scene, period. Now, as you become a better artist and you practice more, you'll start to eliminate for yourself those scenes that weren't as good as others. But until you've done 10 or 20 or 50 or 100, you don't have anything to compare it to. So you just have to start. Otherwise, it's like sitting on your sofa with a map of how to get to South Dakota and just looking at the map, but never taking the first step. At some point, you've got to open up the door and put your foot out and get going. So just dive in. The notan is not a big investment in your time. And then the next thing that we'll be doing, and we'll start that more next week than this week, is getting to a rough sketch of a whole scene. So that's the next step. First, we do the notan, then we do a little rough with a bit more detail in to see what's going on. Okay, so now a little pro tip that I thought I'd add in here. I have these little 3x5 cards I use, and you can see I have these little tick marks at the sides of the rectangles. And that helps me when I'm looking at the scene and I want to know if something's in the middle or in the center. These little tick marks help me. And the other thing I do, this is the other little pro tip that works with these small cards. And you're probably going to say to me, why didn't you tell me, Elizabeth, last week about this? But I only just remembered after the class was over. What I do is I then trace this rectangle in my sketchbook. And then I've already started off with the square or the rectangle the size it needs to be. And it's going to be the same proportions one way or the other as whatever it is I'm looking for. So these are all ways to set yourself up for success. So to give that idea a try. The first things you're going to want to do is get a few lines in the right place based on whatever it is that you see in the viewfinder. Then you can put your viewfinder down and start to really look at the scene and assess, maybe some of this should be middle tone, maybe some of this should be darker. It can be difficult to tell up front exactly, whoops, sorry, I was just checking the chat, exactly what's been going on. So I find often that although I start off with the two values, it can be really useful. And I just did this out of my head. There isn't a reference photo for this. It can be useful to then go, gosh, well, maybe all of that stuff in the background doesn't have to be dark. Maybe some of it, maybe I want those mountains to go even further in the background, and maybe they should be a little bit lighter. So you can make those adjustments after you have the first design worked out. Let's see, whoops. Okay, so here I went back to one of the photos I showed last week, and I sort of rethought it. So the first idea I had was the one right below the photograph, which is one big mass. That's sort of what I saw initially when I squinted my eyes. But when I went back and looked at it again and squinted again, I said to myself, gosh, I could make the ground a middle tone. And that makes an interesting design as well. That would be something that would work. And then I said, well, if I'm going to do that, why don't I try another version that maybe has some of those poles in? Maybe those would be interesting as well. So those are three different ways I decided to look at this particular photo to see if it was going to work as an interesting design or not. Now, if I was actually, me, Elizabeth, if I was going to actually do this drawing, I would probably pick the second version, because although I like from a design point of view how those poles look, I think they would be way too confusing. And I liked the people. I thought the people were the most interesting thing about the scene. So I would decide, gosh, yeah, that was an interesting thing to add in, but it's not really going to work for what I'm trying to do. And so I would go back to my other idea. But this is how I use Notan, as I just work things out. I try to see and assess what it is I'm up to. And here's another example of what I do. So I had some rather bad photos I took from the train on the way into New York City a year or two ago. And I decided that I'd like to make one of these into a painting. But there was so much information. It was so busy. It was really difficult to tell what was going on. So I did the tiny little notan that you can see in the upper left-hand corner, just to establish where was the horizon going to be? What was the contrast going to be? And then I moved to this little sketch here, and I did this. It's still a very small sketch. You can tell from the size of my pencils. But then I started to add in a little bit of, light, dark. I put a little color in because I was working on toned paper. And from that, I was able to establish enough information that I could go to a painting. Or if I wanted to do this as a big drawing, I would know what to eliminate, because my reference photo, not only was it bad, I was actually working from 2 or 3 photos and trying to do a scene, putting them all together. And this sort of gave me the idea of where I was going. This is that next part of the journey, is understanding what your drawing might look big as a big drawing, because there's no point in doing a tiny little notan and then going, great, now I'm going to draw a 20 by 30 drawing and it's going to work out perfectly. And it may, but then again, it may not. So these interim stages, the notan, the small rough sketch, and then the bigger piece, I find to be a really good way to decide what it is you're going to do next. But in the meantime, I also wanted to say that everything doesn't have to come in a rectangle. This isn't the only way you have to draw. I'm starting you off with notan and this, that, and the other, and little boxes to put things in. But when you're actually out sketching someplace, you can draw any way you want, and you can draw single objects, you can draw groups of objects. You don't have to have things in boxes. And so this is an example. I was out at the Field Gallery in West Tisbury, and they have sculptures out in the garden. And I was drawing one of the sculptures. And you can see up in the corner, before I got started, it's not quite a notan, but it's sort of. I just did a little sketch to say, okay, there's some interesting shapes here. I don't want all the other stuff, other bushes and other things that were in there. I just want these simple shapes. And then when I started actually sketching, it was a lot easier to not include everything I saw. So to reiterate about the 50% also, in this particular scene, I don't remember it exactly, but I remember there were a lot of bushes, an extra tree. There's a car parking lot behind here. There were a lot of things that needed to not be in the drawing. So that's what the little sketch, the little kind of notan sketch, and then going to the other drawing, that's how that worked. And we're going to have a couple of opportunities today to draw different things. We're not going to do notan today. We'll get back to those for next week. But I just wanted to run through some of these options. I also wanted to talk. Someone had asked, could you use your camera as a viewfinder? And you can use it, but I wanted to sort of have some caveats here. And I'll be talking about this more as we go through the summer. The lens on your camera does not see things the way you do. So if you're looking at a scene, what you see is close to you and further away. The camera will distort when it takes pictures. It will make, how when you take pictures of rooms sometimes, the interior will seem bigger or wider or longer than it really is. Whereas if you draw that making it look more like the actual size, it won't look like the photograph. So this is why I recommend, even if you don't have time to sit and do an actual sketch, that if you do the notan and maybe even a really tiny little drawing of where things are in relation to each other, and then you can use your photo reference to finish off the drawing at some later point, that will make a much more accurate representation of what you saw that you thought was interesting. Because sometimes, don't you find when you get back from a holiday and you look at your photographs, they really don't represent the feeling and what you saw and sort of the enormity of certain buildings or the scenery. Somehow everything gets kind of watered down. And so without having to carry a camera around that has all kinds of lenses and things to counteract that, those sketches that you do will help you remember what things looked like. And then you just use the photos to fill in the details to make sure, you know how the shadows fall, how the sculpture looks, whatever it happens to be. Another thing I'd like to point out is this example right here. If you can, unless you have a really good reason for wanting distortion in your drawings or paintings, you'll want to correct the distortion you see. So you can see here how the door is leaning to one side and everything is sort of following the perspective up because of the way my camera was tilted. So if I wanted to do this as a drawing, I could either try to fix it either on the computer or my phone or whatever, or I could just draw it correctly by putting down some guidelines that were straight and then drawing my scene accordingly. But I find it a little unnerving sometimes to see that somebody has painted a painting where they've obviously spent hours and hours and hours on it, but they have included this distortion from their camera phone. And sometimes people want that because they're trying to emphasize how tall a building is or how small they are in comparison to something. But often it's just a matter of not noticing that there's a distortion there. So I wanted to point that out before we got started. All right, so let's get on to what we're going to talk about today. So measuring. When I talk about measuring things in a scene, I don't mean like with a ruler. And I don't even mean this business of like holding your thumb up and trying to figure out how many thumbs are in something. What I'm talking about is using a pencil to work out what the angles are to get everything in your scene right from the very beginning. So I'm going to show you how that is done. And the reason I say this is because also if you get yourself right into that drawing and you're in it, you've put all this time and you've done your shading, but you haven't got the measurements of the objects worked out, you're going to be really frustrated at the end because it's going to be hard to fix. So the more you can do up front, the better. So here's an example of what I mean about measuring and using your pencil. So what I do when I'm drawing is if I want to make sure I've got something right, the angle's right, I use the pencil and I hold it up to my scene and I figure out what that angle is. And then one angle at a time, just holding my pencil still and bringing it back over to my sketchbook, I know where the line is supposed to go for that particular angle. So I want to take just a couple of minutes here, and I want you guys to pretend that you are looking at these pile of books with your pencil, and go ahead and hold it up to the screen and try to figure out that lower angle of the pile of books, and then holding your hand steady, just go back over to your sketchbook, or if you have to turn this way to go back to your sketchbook, and look at how that line would then look on your page. You can even draw the line if you want to. But this is what I do. So I do a couple of steps. Sometimes I will just try to draw what I see really quickly, and then I will double check. I'll double check my angles. I'll go, okay, let's just make sure that the angle on the left of the books is right. And you know what? No, it's not quite right. So I'll fix that. Okay, now let me check the bottom of the pile of books, and I'll come back over and I'll check that. And usually I find out that something is off and it was worth the time to actually try and do this business. Now, the reason I like to do it just by eye first is in part because, random lines on a sheet of paper can be confusing. So just having an idea of where I'm trying to go is a good idea. The other thing is I'm trying to train my eye to be accurate the first time. So it's always nice. It's a nice feeling when you're like, oh, I got that right, because your eye really did manage to pick up just how far down did it have to go. This will take a long time for you to develop as a habit. And to be able to do it, without the pencil. So this business of checking your angles, you'll see artists do it all the time. Professional artists do it all the time because there's no point. There's no special prize you get for guessing and being wrong. It's better to check and be right. So let me just move on and show you. So now here I'm adding another object. So before I was looking at the angles. Now, of course, you see the camera distortion going on here in my own scene, but the idea is that, other objects then could get measured to where they are in relation to the objects that you already have. So we had the pile of books. Now I'm looking at the red picture and saying, okay, the bottom of the red picture should match up about with the bottom corner of the pile of books. And the top of the picture sort of has this kind of angle to the corner of the orange book. So it doesn't really matter which points you pick to measure from and which angles you pick to measure from. What you're trying to do is figure out in relation to each other where objects are. And you're using this tool you already have in your hand to do it. So you don't have to worry about, well, okay, so something is half the size of this and it's a quarter of the size, or it's, three of these over. You can use all of that. You can do all of those things if they're helpful. But I find just figuring out the relationships between the objects using my pencil and using angles is such a fast way to go about it. Now, at the bottom picture here, I am showing that I'm also measuring the angle of the handle of the picture. Now, handles of pictures are a pain in the neck to draw. And it's so easy to get them really big. You'll have a picture with an enormous handle on it, or it's really small, or it's distorted. So I will use the pencil to start measuring the angle. And I'll even do it to make small lines going around the curve. I'll make a curve out of a number of different small lines. And that's something we'll talk about also in future classes. But really, if you think about a circle is just lots and lots of tiny little lines viewed from a distance. And so if you think about that zoomed in, you can figure out round objects by using your pencil to go around the edges and draw straight lines, which you can then smooth out later to get an accurate curve. So that's just a little tip for something that we'll end up talking about a lot more later. So then if I add in another object, once again, I've got, I can use angles to measure, the rock from the bottom of the pitcher, the stone to the top of the pitcher. Now, I would not normally go through and set up objects one at a time like this. Normally, I would put the rock and the pitcher and the books there and start, measuring stuff. But I wanted to show this to you because it can be difficult to dive into a complex still life like this and figure it all out to start off with. So when you're setting up your own still life and when you have control over the objects, if you want to like not have other things in and measure things out one at a time and figure out the relationships, it's a useful way to get started. So this is going to be the first thing that we draw, and that's a box. But I'm going to show you a couple of things about it before we get started. So this is, once again, we're not talking about notan at this point. We're just talking about drawing objects because we will have objects in our scenes as we go along, but understanding a little bit about what's going on with them is important. So you look at a box to begin with, you go, yeah, a box, I can draw a box, right? But each of these angles are just a little bit different from each other because of perspective. So if you hold up your pencil and you check the angle of the top flap, the uppermost flap of the box, and then holding your pencil really, really still, pull down and then check that angle at the bottom of the box, there's a gap. That angle is not the same. And that is because of perspective. And we'll be talking about perspective in just a few minutes, and I'll be explaining a little bit more about what's going on. But in the meantime, perspective is one of those words that when I hear it, or at least when I used to hear it, I would just be like, la, 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 I don't want to think about perspective. I don't want to know about the laws of perspective and this, that, and the other, because I wanted to draw. So I wanted to reassure you that if you're careful with your angles, knowing about perspective and how it works is important, but you don't have to draw out grids and you don't have to do a lot of extra work. What you have to be is careful to judge those different angles to see how they work. So if we then measure from side to side, we check the angle on the far left of the box, but then we move our pencil without moving it over to the far right, we'll see that that isn't correct. The line of the corner of the box that's closest to us, the far left and the far right, those are all different angles. So we could just draw this box only measuring with angles, and that's what you're going to do. So this is how I would normally start. I would sketch a box really quickly, and then I would double check the angles as they go up to see how they fall. And then I would check the flaps of the box to each other and sort of go around the edges. So I'm going to show you the big picture and then those little sketches right there. Now, you're not going to have enough time to draw this completely, but I'd like you to just get started just so you get in the habit of starting to figure out these angles, because even something like a box can be a little bit complex. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes here, about 3 or 4 minutes, just to start drawing this and sketching it out. If you want to add the contrast in the interior and such, you can. But really right now, we're just talking about kind of making a wireframe, making just a general picture of what this box looks like. And see if I can answer some of these questions that have come up in chat. Oh, thank you for the compliments on the hair. You guys are going to laugh, but oh, I forgot to make Anna co-host. Oops.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries.
Oh my goodness. I should have read this chat earlier. The hair thing was funny. After I saw the video last week, I was like, oh, it's time to do something about the hair. What I'll do, let's see, someone asked if I could show the sketches I did from either photo. I will definitely do that. I'll incorporate that next week so you can sort of see the whole process. And I usually draw on a slightly angled surface. I find if I have if the paper is flat down in front of me, then my drawing is distorted. So I have it up not probably about a 15-degree, maybe 20-degree angle, sort of as if I were, sitting there with like legs crossed and my sketchbook there, just so that I can see the paper without having to lean over top of it. Oh, someone has said, should I draw the rectangle first? Now, for the box, you don't have to worry about that. You can just start drawing anywhere you want to. Don't even worry about doing the no-tan idea with the light and dark at this point. For this exercise, we're just going to try drawing the box any way you can, because this is just an exercise for trying to work out the angles of things and to make measurements to be able to draw this particular box. So now you could definitely draw the rectangle that is the interior of the box first. That might be a very good starting place. I find different people view it in a different way. Like, I'm trying to think, how would I start? I probably would start trying to draw the box as if it had no flaps on it, and then add the flaps on after and just erase any lines that were underneath. So I think people probably have different ways they would go about it. And don't worry, just dive in and give it a try, because you will get this image and all of the other things that we look at today to try on your own time. I always find, and I find this when I give private lessons to people, there's nothing more awful than having the teacher either telling you, you've only got 2 more minutes, or looking over your shoulder, right? Because you're just sweating, your hands are sweating, you're going, oh, I'm not getting this right. You're just hoping it just ends, make the torture end, So I feel like the torture is the class. And then I want you afterwards, with your favorite music playing, and when you feel like you're a little bit more relaxed, to try this again. But it's worth going through this when I can actually sort of guide you and tell you what to do. So go ahead and wrap up your sketch, because we're going to get on to the next bit. And like I said, you'll have plenty of time to do this later. And I'm going to take a sip of coffee. And I'm so sorry about not making you a co-host earlier. I need to make a little sticky of all the things I have to run through up front.
No, I'll remember. But your participants have been very, very, very good about muting themselves, and that was my concern. But so we're good.
Oh, good. Okay, super.
Yep.
All right, moving right along. Okay, so I thought I'd include this. So sometimes you have to edit things out of a drawing. And I found this picture because I thought this was the funniest thing. So an interesting exercise in editing would be to try to draw this box without the cat in, or with the cat in if you want to. You can measure angles. Where is that tail? Where exactly is that? But I loved this picture and I thought this was hilarious. This is not my cat, but this is a cat with the attitude that my cat has. So anyway, I just thought I'd enjoy that. So I'm about to start talking about more details about perspective. These are the 2 things I don't want you to do right now. I don't want you either falling asleep or checking your phone if you can possibly help it. I promise we're going to get through this really, really quickly and get on to the next bit. But it's really important that I do actually show you these basic principles of perspective and move right along. Whoops, let me get there we go. Okay, so perspective is just the art of drawing solid objects on a 2-dimensional surface, our paper, so to give the impression of their right height, depth, and position in relation to each other when viewed from a particular point. So that's when viewed from our eye level, basically. Everything we look at, we're seeing from our eye level, whether we're crouching down or at the top of a building. So 1-point perspective, this is like when you're looking down a road or a set of railroad tracks and everything is vanishing, everything is getting smaller as it goes away to you to the point where you can hardly see it. And 2-point perspective is when you're looking at the corner of your house, and one edge of your house will look smaller going one way, and one edge of your house will look smaller going the other way, and the biggest edge will be the one that's closest to you. Now, the reason why we have to talk about perspective and all of this is because our brain, as I mentioned before, is constantly giving us information and telling us different stuff. So what it tells us when we look when we stand at the corner of our house or our apartment building or whatever and look at it, it's not saying, "Hey, look at that interesting perspective and those vanishing points." What it is saying is, this is a large rectangular building of about 20 by 70 with windows that are about 4 by 2. It's giving us this information. In other words, it's giving us information in the way that we might think of an Egyptian hieroglyphic frieze, where everything is exactly the same size and proportion. It is not telling us, hey, and as that building disappears in perspective, that other side now looks like it's only about 50 feet high or whatever it happens to be. We have to rely on our eyes to override that information our brain is giving us, that factual information about these objects. We have to look and see, what does the fact that objects get smaller as they recede into the distance, what does that mean when we actually look at something? So this is why the business of the pencil and the angles is useful, because this is the tool that allows us to override that information, those facts that our brain is feeding in. Now, those facts are useful, but they're not the only thing we need to worry about. And then 3-point perspective is likewise, there are two vanishing points. In other words, if you kept drawing the line of the angle of the top of the building plus the ground in a continuous line, you'd hit a vanishing point that is way out on the left, likewise on the right, and likewise as the building goes up. The vanishing point is just the term that's used to describe what happens as those two lines meet as they go towards the horizon or go up or down in either direction. At some point, they are going to meet. So when we look outside, say you have a deck or say you have some steps, sooner or later, if you were to draw a line from the angle of one side, the line from the angle of the other side, they're not exactly the same. Sooner or later, somewhere, maybe, way out beyond the trees or whatever, those lines are going to meet. So that is a vanishing point. I do not usually use these terms a lot when I'm drawing. I might talk about horizon line. I may refer to vanishing point, but 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, 3-point perspective, I don't harp on these particular points because I'm more concerned that you spend time looking at the objects and figuring out what's going on, but knowing in the back of your mind why you're seeing things like this. So once again, another thing that happens, this is really important, for example, when you're doing still life and things like this, depending on where you are, it says worm's eye view, but that really is also your eye view. Wherever you are, as objects go up above you or down below you, you'll either be able to see the bottom of those objects or the top of those objects. So if you're standing over top of a table, of course, you're seeing the top of the table. You can't see underneath it. But if you were to levitate that table up near the ceiling, you would see below it. But those same angles of perspective would still apply. You would still have vanishing points because the far edges of the table are going to be smaller because they're moving away from your eyes. So objects in real life, of course, are not literally smaller on the other sides. This is just what our eyes see. As we see people that are further away in the distance, they look smaller to us than the people up front. But our brains override that. And they say, oh, that's a guy that's 6 feet tall. And we can say, we know that even if he's 100 feet away, our brains know that. They make the internal calculation. But when we draw that person, we have to draw them in relation to what we are looking at the time. And that's when this information starts to become useful. I've got some examples here to show you. So here's a street view, and you can see this happening. Those buildings in real life, of course, are all about the same height as each other. But when we look at a scene in real life, so where we're standing right now is going to be wherever the sort of like a horizontal line. So you can see the end of the road way down in the distance. That's pretty much level with our eyes because you can see the lines are all heading up towards that point, the street lines, the railings, this, that, and the other. But when they get above our eye level, all the lines of the buildings and the shutters and the tops of the doorways and the tops of the buildings are heading down. So this is an important fact to know about, because if you're drawing buildings, for example, you're drawing a street scene and it's starting to go wrong, it is very likely to be because of your perspective. It is very likely to be that somehow some of these angles aren't working quite right. So if you hold your pencil up and you look at the tops of these buildings, that's a really acute angle. That's heading, I mean, that's, what, almost 11 o'clock on the left hand side, maybe, on the other side, it's probably about 1 o'clock. And then as you come down, you're sort of going around the hands of the clock until you get to the curb that's right in front of us, which is just about 6 o'clock. So where these lines are on your drawing has everything to do with whether this drawing will look realistic or not. So that's just something to keep in mind. And the same thing happens when you're looking at the interior of a room. Now you've got 2-point perspective happening. You've got lines going off in different directions. If you were to take the top and the bottom lines of any of these sides of the cube and head them off in different directions, they would end up getting closer to each other as they went off into the distance. Now, when you're sitting inside a room, you don't really think about that, but it is important. And I would like all of you guys right now, using your pencil, to look around your room and look up at the corner. Check with your pencil up at the corner where the ceiling meets the top of the wall, and then pull that. I don't know if you might have windows, you might have some pictures on the wall. See how you have to keep moving that pencil, how that angle has to keep shifting in order to get down to where the floor meets the wall. So there are a lot of changes to angles that go on as you go up and down. Now, if you can see something that's about at eye height, maybe it's a table or maybe it's the edge of a picture or something, you'll see that that line is pretty much straight. It's pretty much parallel to the floor. So the ones that are above your eye height, those are all going to angle in one direction, and all of the angles below your eye level are going to angle in the other direction. Now, what this means is when you're looking at somebody else's painting or somebody else's photograph, you'll be able to tell where their eye level was, because that'll be where everything is parallel to the floor, where there's a horizon line. So that's just something kind of interesting. And in your own artwork, you can decide where you think a scene has a lot of impact based on where your eye level is. So if you're down low, things loom above. If you're up high, you're taller, you're larger than the scene. And that has a lot to do with what you're trying to show. We'll talk about this next week, but if you're out in the landscape and you're trying to show how enormous the trees are, you're down low, the trees are looming up high. If you're trying to show how beautiful this city is that's laid out before you, you're up above, and all the perspective lines that you see will be below you, and the angles will be below you. So like I said, we'll show you some examples as we go through next week. This is just something to bear in mind. So here's an example of a house, and now I'm sure you can see right away how this works in this photograph. We are probably at, let's see, where are we? We're probably like halfway up the stairs in terms of where our eyes are. And you can see that all the angles of the sofa and even up to the top of the kitchen counter, they're all just a little bit below our eye level. And then you start to get, if you're looking over at the kitchen, you start looking up at the bits of the ceiling. That's definitely above our eye level. You can also see that there's perspective heading two ways. There are lots of different angles in this. It can get very confusing. Now, if I'm going to draw an interior scene, to begin with, I'm usually never going to draw something like this. But if I was going to, then I would very quickly sketch out where some of these major lines were, just off the top of my head, going, I think the table's here. I think the edge of the carpet is here. I think the edge of the walkway think that, the kitchen is like that. And then I'd start double checking it all because for sure I would have some of this stuff wrong. But once you start to see perspective, it overrides that information in your brain that's telling you that things are completely different. So this works for angles, for cylinders as well. Um, Cylinders like a cup that's lying over on its side in space will start to vanish away. The vanishing point will mean that the far end of the tipped over cup is smaller than the one that's closest to you. Likewise, if you're looking at the top of a telephone pole versus the bottom of a telephone pole, those are just bunches of different circles that are disappearing as they're going up and down. And here I've got a couple of glass lampshades that sort of show you how that works. The top of the cylinder, which is above our eyes, we can see more of it and we can see less of it as it comes down to the very bottom. So how that works on something like a teacup, for example, when you're doing a still life, is that that saucer is more round than the oval of the top of the teacup. So just to move back for a second, you can see how at eye level, the oval of the top of a teacup is really flat. And as you would move down to the saucer, it gets rounder. So that's how that works. And this will be our second drawing example for the day, is going to be drawing a teacup and trying to get some idea of this idea of perspective, the oval at the top being smaller than the oval below. Now, I also use angles when I draw something like this to try to get the relative shape of an object pretty close to what I'm seeing. Now, so if you take a couple of minutes just to go ahead and sketch this out, you can do it really quickly, but just to get an idea of looking at objects like this and seeing how, in perspective, how it changes the way we look at things. Now, this is going to, like I said, this is a little on the dry side, but it's going to apply quite a bit when we start doing landscapes, still life, and particularly when we start doing people, objects together in scenes. It really applies to everything else that we'll be drawing as we go on through the summer. Is just having a little bit of understanding about how where our eyes are affect everything we see. And if it doesn't, and if we haven't drawn those ovals correctly, it makes things look odd. It makes tables look as if they're turning the wrong way. If you have a whole bunch of objects, for example, out in a still life, and the relative ovals aren't sort of at the same angle as each other as objects get taller or smaller, it makes them look as if they're all kind of wonky and moving across the table in an odd way. And it can be very frustrating, I think, when you're beginning to draw, to have these sorts of things happen in your drawing and not really understand how to make it how to make it stop, not really going, oh, where on earth how do I fix this? And so if you do find you're doing a drawing that is a still life, or that you're doing a city scene and there's something that isn't quite right about it, angles is where you start. And then this next thing that you start is double checking that perspective and to see if it is actually working in real life. The other thing that is really useful is, and I'll repeat this probably a lot during the summer, is to spend more time looking at what you're going to draw than looking at your paper. So if you've started drawing and I'm only going to give you a few minutes. So of course you're getting right into it right now. But when you go back to have a look at this again, with both the box and the teacup, I know these are super simple objects, but I want you to sit there and really look at them and sort of imagine, okay, think to yourself, okay, how wide is that oval at the top that makes the opening of the teacup? And then, how small do I have to get down to the bottom? And, if I squinted it, is there any shading? Well, not really, because this is lit in such a way that there isn't a lot of shading. What is the angle of that handle? And just take a little bit of time to actually look at the object. What happens to artists and professional artists as well, and painters and people drawing and all sorts of things, is you start to get into your drawing and you're not looking at the object you're drawing anymore. And you're drawing away, you're drawing away, you're shading, you're doing all this stuff. And all of a sudden you look up and it doesn't look the way you meant it to. And you're not quite sure what happened. But usually it's because you did spend more time looking at your paper than actually at the object. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot to be said as an artist for using your scene as reference. And then maybe there is a time during your drawing where you're like, you know what, I don't need that anymore. I just need to concentrate on how this drawing looks in and of itself and to see if that works. So there's room for both approaches, but that is just something to consider. I know these are exercises. What I would like for you to do during the course of this week is pick some objects around your house, or pick a scene, or maybe you have a photo you've taken, and just sort of practice this business of checking the angles and seeing how it works. Maybe put two objects together and see how accurately you can draw them in relation to each other to see if you can get the proportions right. This is one of those things that once we've gone through these basic exercises, from this point on, we'll just start drawing stuff. We'll start drawing things in scenes as we go through all the different drawing media over the next few weeks. But I wanted you to have these basics down. With these essentials, the idea of the notan, picking your design for the scene, the idea of angles and perspective. Those are the basic tools. We'll be able to get a lot done now you know this. All right, I am going to move on at this point and show you just one or two more things. So once again, this is a really complex scene, but you can see how I've selected some of the ovals that I know exist. Now, a couple of things are happening, right? Some of these objects are tilting away from us. They're not all in a row. They're not just like rows that we can count on of being, larger or smaller ovals. So what do you do in a situation like this? Well, what I did was I selected a few ovals of objects that I could see around this scene that I knew were pretty much level. And I went ahead and sketched those out and said, okay, I know that my perspective is working right. I can tell from this photograph where I'm standing, where the green line is, that's basically where everything is parallel. And above and below that, I can go ahead and I know that the openings below me will open up larger and the openings above me will disappear. I won't be able to see into those particular terracotta pots. So this is a very complex kind of scene. When you get into something like this, you're doing a lot of checking angles, measuring against each other. And of course, to take something like this on and draw it without having had some practice at drawing teacups or bowls or vases would be really difficult. But this is how you go about it, is by just trying to identify where you're standing, what should be opening up below you, and what should be disappearing above you. That will really help you take on something like this. So just to wrap up perspective and measuring, when you're trying to draw, you're trying to create the impression of a 3D object on a 2D surface. So these kind of tools and tricks, using contrast, using perspective, measuring with angles will help you create that illusion. Now, I don't always think that a drawing has to be realistic, but we're starting with realism just to get the idea of how things work so that we can break them apart later. And these are the tools, the notan, the small sketch, angles, perspective, measuring. It'll help you make things look real, and it'll reduce the amount of frustration you experience when things start going wrong. Objects and scenery always get smaller as they go away from you. Sometimes it's hard to tell because you might have a bunch of things on your table, and to you in your brain, your brain says, hey, all of these 3x5 cards are 3x5, right? But when you actually start to sketch them out and measure them, you'll realize that as those 3x5 cards disappear further away from you on the table, they actually do get smaller. This is how you create that sense of that illusion. And I would look at some other artwork or other photographs, or even photographs you've done, and try to figure out where you were. Where were you standing when you took that picture? Or where was the photographer standing? Where was that artist standing when he painted that scene? That'll give you an idea of, did they get the perspective right? Because particularly in artwork, they often didn't. And so that'll give you, if you can find mistakes in other people's artwork, it will help you figure out where the mistakes are in yours when you get to that particular point. So use your pencil, always check your angles, use that viewfinder. And now that I'm going to stop sharing at this point. So now that I've really beaten those basics into you and you know all about that stuff, now we can move on from this point. Next week, we can have some fun landscape drawing. And I'm going to show you a bunch of different techniques for how to deal with, we're dealing with a lot of green out there, right? How do you make it look interesting? The grass, the grass that's close, grass that's further away, the trees, the mountains, the hills, whatever it is you're looking at. How do you do something with all of that to make it an interesting looking scene? And how does that tie back to notan and doing sketches? So what we're going to do next week is we'll be looking at different type of scenes. I'll be showing you different techniques. I've got some little videos of me actually drawing so you can see how I do it. And I know that the last couple of weeks I haven't had an opportunity to do that, and I'm really looking forward to showing you some techniques by hand. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to go from the notan to the small rough sketch, sort of like you saw I had in the sketchbook, where I had something a little more detailed. And we'll start easing ourselves towards larger drawings by going through these steps. Now, like I said, I'm a painter. So I often just stop at that sketch stage and I just go, okay, this is the information I need. So that when I'm looking at my photographs, I can edit. I can say, hey, no, I already took out that information. I can just not pay attention to what's in my photo. I can just sort of use a mixture of both things. I can use my photo, but I've got my own view of how things ought to go. And that's what's based in this sketch. And this is how you start getting your own style and your own vision, is by not relying on the photo to tell you what to draw. You're relying on your own instinct to tell you what to draw. And so during the course of this summer, I'm going to be trying to hone that instinct by making you go through these preliminary steps, because this is how you get there. This is how you unwind your personal vision from what the phone or the camera tells you should be looking at. All right. So there we go. That was a bunch of dry stuff, but I'm hoping I hope you'll practice this a little bit during the course of the next week. It'll pay off in dividends through the course of the summer. So I'll send you the PDF like I did last time. I didn't get much chance to talk about materials and such today. We'll just be starting with pencils next week, so we'll be set. I'll make sure I start building in a little bit more of that information. I am going to do a little video that is just about materials to help out so that we don't have to spend a lot of time in each class talking about them. I'll have that done before next week's class so we can start from there. But thank you so much. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Thank you for walking through all of that. Thank you for not falling asleep halfway through. I really appreciate it.